Rural communities and water infrastructure haven't really been well constructed, and the demand for water storage is significant. There just isn't access to bulk water infrastructure and taps, and on that basis, there is a primary demand for being able to store water. Blow-moulding technology on a large scale to make water tanks is a disruptor. Those that lived in the Western Cape that went through sort of day zero in 2018, you saw a massive behavioural change. People were talking about, the 2-minute shower. Water is life. We've got to think carefully of how we manage our water resources and protect them and change probably our behaviours, as you say. This is going to potentially be really a massive, massive issue for all of us. It's life and it's fundamental. That's what it is. That would go a long way to try and obviously reduce this crisis.
Well, across South Africa, intermittent supply and quality concerns are accelerating the shift to durable decentralized storage. Tanks, boreholes and rainwater harvesting that keep households, schools and rural communities resilient when our systems falter. The question is how to scale these solutions safely, affordably and with dependable quality at the tap. Welcome to the Safripol Water Security Engagement Forum. I'm your host as always, Michael Avery, and joining me today is Craig Forbes, Investment Director at Forbes Capital. He's also a director across multiple African portfolio companies, including involvement with Africa Tanks. Now, he's got more than 25 years experience in South Africa, the UK and the US. He brings a practitioner's view of capital allocation, risk and execution. And today's conversation explores robust water storage for crisis management and rural settings and how those lessons really translate to suburban homes and public facilities. So, Craig, great to have you on. And I must say, the work that you do with Africa Tanks really does take you to the coalface of our water crisis in South Africa. So from that vantage point, what are you seeing across the country in terms of how this crisis is manifesting in rural communities across the country?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I think in South Africa, rural communities and water infrastructure haven't really been well constructed, and there's just numerous examples we see day in and day out where the demand for water storage is significant, and we don't foresee there being a massive change in the short to medium term unless bulk water infrastructure is constructed and goes past and, you get a tap in everyone's home.
Yeah.
And there's just numerous communities in, major big provinces, populous provinces, especially up north, inland, where there just isn't access to, bulk water infrastructure and taps. And on that basis, there is a primary demand for buying water tanks and being able to store water.
Now, you've worked in finance, private equity, corporate finance, and now find yourself as a director of Africa Tanks. Must be an interesting story behind that and how you got involved in this space. Can you take us back to those early days?
The water tank industry has been around for probably 50-something years. Mm-hmm. And the technology that was used and has been used is predominantly called rotomoulding. What came along and discovered by the guy that founded the business we bought, Africa Tanks, is blow-moulding technology on a large scale to make water tanks. And he actually wanted to emigrate to Australia, and we loved the technology. We loved the fact that there was a new technology in the space that frankly is a disruptor. My father and I, through our family office, acquired this business in 2020, and we've been able to really grow the business, not only I think through sort of market gains, but also market share gains, taking business from our competitors. It's a space where I think, like many other industries, where you see service failure, at a sort of local level or national level, there's an opportunity to bring a solution. So the technology is excellent. We argue ourselves as the lowest cost producer, which means it's sustainable. And I think it's a product we're proud of because it changes livelihoods. So it really does provide a massive, durable and high utility value to people who need and purchase the product daily.
Yeah, that famed South African resilience. You know, you speak to entrepreneurs in South Africa versus entrepreneurs in Europe, and we're moving into a world because of climate change and all of that variability where you're going to have to be very resilient and adaptable. And I think it's core to South Africa's DNA. What is it about the technology, that blow moulding versus the old roto technology, that makes it so much more competitive and low cost?
Look, I think it comes down to our manufacturing sort of setup where we need, frankly, less people in our factories to make a tank. So it's a much more monoline sort of process, requires fewer people, fewer labour, labour, and on that basis, our throughput, the cycle time it takes us to make a tank, is much quicker. So any given factory, what we can crank out in 24 hours requires many more people and potentially a lot more machines, rotomoulding versus blow-moulding.
Now, I want to come back to the local community solutions you've seen work in more rural areas. I know you've partnered and done a lot of work with Gift of the Givers, and they're an organisation that really does exceptionally well in these communities. They're trusted. But when we talk innovation, it always amazes me how low-tech innovation is often the most impactful in these spaces. And we're just talking about a storage drum for water, and it can be transformational. So what are the kinds of innovations that you've seen really most effective in these communities?
The technology solutions coming out, if you look globally, in the space, there's some fancy, very sophisticated, impressive technologies out there with smart meters, and if you look now at the way water can get stored, the pumps, the various other sort of solutions as part of fancy tech to monitor, to manage, to make sure water's sanitized and cleaned. Excellent. But at the end of the day, I think affordability is a massive issue in our country. We're not a wealthy country. We have a number of, I'd say, I don't know the exact percentage, but a massive lion's share of the percentage of South Africa is sitting probably below an LSM 5 or 6. Yeah. So I think value and affordability is key. And when it comes to the world of water tanks, ultimately the lion's share is about people that can use stockful money, social grant money, savings, etc., to ultimately save up and purchase their own tank. We see, for example, in numerous examples or in numerous instances where stockfels will pool money together and a number of people will come and purchase a tank, and that tank will live amongst 3 or 4 homes, and they will share the water. Oh. The goal being ultimately for everyone to have their own tank or multiple tanks. So, when you talk about innovation, there's nothing fundamentally amazing about that, but it talks to the Maslow hierarchical needs that water is life, and if you have a tank and you can store enough water to see you through a week, 2 weeks, etc., that's very important.
Yeah, it's social innovation as well, and tapping into that Ubuntu that we naturally have in our communities.
Yes.
When you look at the water challenge, and I think we've got experience, obviously, with Cape Town and Day Zero, but with load shedding, it seemed to be, and maybe outside of the more rural, less affluent communities, a challenge, but a challenge that was solvable. If you had resources, you could invest in solar and battery backups and inverters, and you could fix it. The water challenge is slightly less amenable to such a decentralized solution. How would you characterize the water challenge in South Africa?
I think supply of water is sort of a sovereign, it's owned by South Africa as such. So it's complicated. Your ability to potentially source water, I guess, really comes through an element either of harvesting, which is very seasonal, or alternatively, there are some newer technologies coming around sort of atmospheric harvesting, etc., but that's very early stage, very expensive at this point. So the ability for us to source water outside of, our rainy seasons is going to come through the way we receive our water, which is frankly through government, in whichever shape or form. The Department of Water and Sanitation's, along with sort of local municipalities, are responsible for our dams. The dams, then come to the water boards, and the water boards then move the water to our municipalities. As you said, electricity crisis, load shedding, etc. Again, electricity was, sourced and supplied by national government through Eskom and our municipalities. But with solar, you could now sort of, interpose your own system to create electricity. Water, it's a very different animal. Outside of boreholes, which are very expensive, there isn't a guarantee as to how much water, the yield you'll get from that. There's also permitting now in place, so whether or not you will receive approval for that. So your ability to source water is exceptionally challenging and not something you can easily, take on and solve for by yourself. I think when it comes to storage, that's something you can control. And again, it's quite a simple process that if you have the financial resources, you can put a lot of storage in place. And you could argue, frankly, that for most homes in South Africa, those that have homes, a number of people have swimming pools. That is a water reservoir right there. It's quite crude, but nonetheless, you have a source of water that you're storing on your premises. As soon as you start now moving into a world where you want to put water tanks in and sort of attach it to your municipal connection, that creates more complexity. You will need a pump with that. And invariably, if load shedding were to come back, that pump needs to have an electricity connection. You've got natural water pressure that comes to the end of your tap. As soon as you interpose inline water storage, you lose that water pressure. Right. And suddenly you will need a pump to go with that. With a pump, electricity connection, the consistency of electricity and the supply to that pump is important to make sure when you turn on your tap, you have water. So, I think this is a lot more complex than what we faced and have seemed to have managed successfully through load shedding. But it's going to require, frankly, an all hands on deck and a crisis management approach from national, provincial, municipal to the end user, I think.
Yeah, well, that's one thing that has certainly come through the conversations is the complexity, but also the responsibility that does rest on the end user's shoulders. And I think anyone who's lived through a water outage anywhere in the country becomes acutely aware of just how much water you're using when you flush a toilet, for example, or how much we're wasting when we leave the tap running while brushing our teeth.
I think just on that point, I think behavioural change will need to happen. I think those that lived in the Western Cape that went through sort of day zero in 2018, you saw a massive behavioural change. People were talking about, the 2-minute shower, changing, the faucet on your tap, these very small, sort of high pressure, reduce ultimately the usage, change your, as you say, the cistern and your toilets, less water used, many interventions that you can reduce your water usage. And I think that behavioural change should already be happening in South Africa across the board, and probably not enough's happened on that score.
Especially inland, especially in Gauteng, we've been spoiled for far too long.
Globally, there's a stat about our average use of water per day, per person, which is around, I think, 200 litres.
Yes, yeah.
My understanding is, especially in Gauteng, we're more like 300.
Yeah.
And I think again there's a perfect example of a 50% reduction we probably can achieve just through behavioural changes that would go a long way to try and obviously reduce this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Again, a question of who leads the messaging, because that is going to require a concerted public education campaign where possible, and to do so at a time when we can see the impacts of a lack of maintenance at a municipal level. There's almost this idea of not wanting to do anything and passing the buck and saying, but local government's not doing its job. We see all of these bursts and we can all feel it on a daily basis. I want to come back to the tanks themselves though. So they look very low tech, but you've got to store water in it for an extended period of time, and you don't want it to become contaminated. So what is the technology that goes in behind the tanks to ensure that you're ensuring the water quality at the same time as ensuring that you can store it for extended periods of time?
Yeah, look, I think when you've got municipal inline storage, so that's where your municipal connection comes in, you've installed water tanks and you've added a pump, and that's gone into your water mains into your home. Frankly, you're using water, almost every hour of the day. That water in those tanks will get cycled all the time.
Right.
I think there needs to be more work on testing our drinkable water and how long it can live and survive in a water tank that's exposed to the elements, frankly, because it's outside, around bacterial levels, algae levels, and how drinkable it is. But for the main, just given how you flush in the toilet, you brushing your teeth, you're washing clothes, dishes, showering, etc., that water circulating all the time, there isn't a huge risk in terms of inline storage for that water to circulate and still be drinkable, right. even if it's left for, say, 48 hours, 72 hours. I think extended periods of time will require testing. But, you've seen there's a number of significant, again, technology improvements on filters that have happened now, where you've got infrared filters, you've got sort of inline filters that the water goes through and does from macro filters to micro filters. So again, you've seen in many establishments the taps, a small water tap with a filtration system, under the sink. So the ability to continue to make sure ultimately the quality of our water is there and it's safe to drink, I think, those filter systems have definitely gained prominence and will continue to form part of the ecosystem.
Just shows you how the technology is evolving to keep pace and adapt to the deployment of these tanks. We're starting to see them become a feature in certain neighborhoods in kind of leafy suburbs around the place. From where you sit, what is the current uptake of these tanks, and what kind of runway is there for installation? Do we have the skills on the ground, the plumbers, the artisans, the electricians? Because I have a feeling there's going to be a massive demand. What is it, 20,000 Rand an installation, roughly?
Yes, I think historically the demand in South Africa has probably been rural and agricultural.
Right.
And that we see that sustaining itself for a long time to come. I think, as you point out, in urban areas where everyone's had the luxury and the benefit of continuous water supply coming out of your tap, and that water shedding and that water leaks and all the issues that we're facing now in our urban areas, we absolutely foresee people needing to invest in tanks, inline municipal backup. And, the good news, I guess, to some extent, is our hardware retailers do stock these products. And there are a number of tank suppliers in the country that, we can ultimately, I think, look, how big could the crisis be? It could be significant. Could there be a shortage? Absolutely. But there's I think when we looked at going back to load shedding, there was no local suppliers really, I don't think, of solar panels and inverters. And this was generally imported from China. So how quickly a ship could dock, how many, could arrive, where I think the manufacturing capacity in South Africa for tanks is significant. And there are a number of manufacturers. So, there's a delivery system and a distribution system through, the major hardware retailers that do stock tanks. But then you come to that last mile, as you say, which is ultimately now taking the product, from pipes to pumps to water tanks and installing it in your home, getting access to your home, getting a quote, accepting the quote, coming through your door and putting that system in place. And that, much like what you saw with solar, I think there is an element of a service delivery challenge that could happen if there's suddenly a massive crisis and everyone wants that installed at the same time. You're going to see bottlenecks happen. So, the truth be told, I think often people wait till the crisis hits.
Yeah.
But there has been quite a few warning signs we've already seen in numerous areas around Gauteng, Pretoria, Johannesburg, West Rand, East Rand, where I think people have already been installing tanks, and we have seen that pick up in demand. But I think, as you say, we feel like we're at the early stages of a 10-year crisis for us to kind of manage and handle. And I think there's many opportunities of smart, efficient ways to try and get water tanks installed in every home. But, just making the important point that putting tanks in is going to buy you time. But it doesn't mean, if there was a month of no supply, I think we'd be in serious trouble.
That's not the silver bullet.
Correct.
And
we're talking mainly here about households as opposed to companies. And businesses. And, again, the water needs in certain industries are significant. So, can a head office function for 2 weeks if you've got 1,000 employees in a building and there isn't enough water supply? So, that could cause a massive disruption, let alone industrial businesses, etc., which generally are more water intensive.
Yeah, that doesn't detract from the urgency of the situation at a national level. We really almost need to convene a national dialogue around our water infrastructure, and we can go into all kinds of detail around what needs to change from a regulatory perspective, from a capacity and political perspective. But I want to talk about how you've aligned capital with purpose around what you're doing here, because the partnership with Gift of the Givers is very interesting. Before we came on, you were talking about partnering again with them, and how you've approached this. It's almost like an impact mission that you've got, Craig.
Any South African company, we're very proud of the product we make, and everything about what we make, our water tanks, Africa Tanks water tanks, comes from South Africa. We source our polymer from Safripol. We use 100% South Africans as our workforce. We make a fantastic product that, impacts and changes livelihoods in South Africa. So I think that in and of itself, it gives us a responsibility to help where we can. And I think the example you gave earlier with Gift of the Givers, we partnered with Safripol ourselves, and we went to Gift of the Givers. It was on the back of the floods in KZN.
Yeah.
And we were able to mobilize and donated 3 million litres of water storage to Gift of the Givers. And, as we were talking earlier, when Gift of the Givers arrives, at the coalface of a crisis, I think they've got the buy-in and the trust of communities. And
when tempers are already at boiling point.
Exactly. And here you've got, people that were displaced from their homes, hungry, water infrastructure was damaged, so access to water. And we were able to, provide them with tanks. They were able to take those tanks, to where the need was exceptionally acute, and ultimately, bring all the other important, solutions, services and supplies to try and make sure that, water is now stored And from water comes food, comes sanitation, everything else. So that was a perfect example again of where companies can partner, with government or NGOs, etc., to try and help and solve problems. I think, at the main, though, our business is about selling tanks, and we are a capitalist business. We're in it to make money. But nonetheless, I think the social impact of the product is significant. And there's a need, and there's a growing need for it. And I think most importantly, Michael, it is relatively affordable. So as I was saying to you, if you go on any website now and you can search water tanks, a retail price is roughly around R1 a litre. So a 5,000 litre tank, you probably can buy somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 rand.
Yeah.
Compared to solar, inverters and batteries, etc., a massive investment that required relative to this. So again, it's quite affordable. Again, if you keep it simple, you can install it almost immediately. But the honest truth is we're only solving a storage issue. We aren't solving the supply issue. And the supply issue, that is a much more complex issue to solve for. And there's many areas where I think there can be significant improvements: behavioural change, public-private partnerships, that last mile delivery of our water infrastructure, where, to your point, I think there needs to be I think with load shedding, there was a war room. And I think we need a similar mindset at a national level that says, listen, this is going to potentially really a massive, massive issue for all of us. So I think it requires that level of urgency and seriousness to try and tackle it.
On that point, just a little bit longer, what would a water war room entail in terms of better enabling public-private partnerships? Because I think there are lots of, especially large businesses, who are very acutely aware of the impending crisis. But when you look at the natural monopoly nature of delivery of bulk water, for example, and you're not going to have people laying multiple different pipes, it is very much about getting the current system working better and more fit for purpose. So are we saying, let's outsource that function of, say, Joburg Water, for example, to a private entity? How would that work in your mind?
Look, I'm not the expert here, so I'll give you what my personal view is, but that's all it is not definitely not an expert in the field. But I think you've got, in South Africa, there's been quite a lot of legislative changes already that have happened that to some extent allow for an element of privatization of WSPs, water service providers.
Right.
And I think there's one example in the north coast of KZN where the municipal water infrastructure is taken over by a private entity. They collect their revenue through the municipal collection services. So every month you're paying your rates and taxes and your levies, and they'll get their portion. They're then tasked with managing that water infrastructure, delivering that water ultimately to your tap. And there's various, obviously, service level requirements, maintenance requirements, etc. And the big issue, I think, for any last mile delivery or water service provider is this element of non-revenue water.
Yeah.
And what we are seeing across South Africa is the percentage of non-revenue water is getting to crisis point. Gauteng, there was a report published in 2023, and I think KZN's non-revenue water is 60%.
Wow.
Gauteng is 50%. The Free State is 50%. The Western Cape is the best at 27.5%. The Northwest is 56%. So you just think of any business and, your revenue says 100, but
you're
collecting 40 or 50.
Yeah.
It's impossible for your business to sustain itself or be profitable. And that's what's happening here is we've got this massive non-revenue water that's going out, illegal connections, leaks, lack of maintenance, etc. And the municipalities ultimately are collecting less money. they're paying less money to the water boards, and the water boards are responsible for sewage works, maintenance, bulk dams, infrastructure. So
it's a death spiral.
It's a death spiral. The example of, the sort of Dolphin Coast or Northern KZN, and I think in Mbombela, two examples where there's been this privatization of that last mile of water infrastructure. They've managed to bring down that non-revenue water percentage to a much, much lower number. And you can just imagine, well, if you're charging 100 and you're collecting 97, you can maintain, you can be profitable, you can fix things. So I think to some extent, the legislation is happening. There are examples, but the urgency and then understanding the difference between national, provincial and local to now deliver a solution where you can decentralize these various areas and privatize. I don't quite know how that could work, but that to me feels like the likely route we'll need to go.
And one hopes that if we do see that urgency, it'll focus on that in particular in a war room type setting to say, how do we ensure that we can enable that? We had Sean Phillips on the show talking to some of the, shall we call them, political challenges when it comes to dealing at a national level with local government. But I want to come back to rainwater harvesting, and if we look at that as being touted as obviously a temporary solution here, what are some of the key enablers, but also some of the pitfalls that a home or a school needs to be aware of when they think of installing tanks along with rainwater harvesting as a kind of temporary solution?
Look, I would argue it's not temporary. I think it's seasonal.
Right.
So the truth is, if you're sitting up in the Highveld, our sort of rain season really is, October to March. And during that time, I think the opportunity to harvest rain, you should do it. It's likely to require an element of some reconfiguration of your, the piping off your roof, and channeling that towards tanks. You can easily daisy chain tanks, so you can link them up, and you can try and obviously then capture and harvest this water. I think you have to, as soon as you do that, you obviously have to think carefully just about making sure that water is drinkable. So there is additional investment you would need, to make sure ultimately it's safe to drink. But there's absolutely no reason not to do that. I think the point here is, given seasonality, it's no silver bullet. And examples of boreholes where people have been able to install them and got the permits, they don't last forever. The quality of that water you need to obviously test. There can be, all sorts of chemicals in the ground, different rock types, that can have an impact on minerality, on drinkability, the hardness of the water, et cetera, et cetera. So again, there's definitely things you can do, and we would highly advocate people to think about putting tanks in to try and harvest when it is rainy season. And you can then use that to your garden, your pool, connect it into your water mains to service for your home. Obviously, allied to that is then putting inline tanks, where you're connecting it to your water mains. And I think you have to think holistically about this. But it does, as you start adding to now somewhat, trying to solve your own water generational needs, it does start adding quite a lot of cost to this investment.
But it is a cost. I mean, you talk about overcapitalizing a home. Sometimes you are adding value. And I'm sure in the resale market, if you've got a home that's got solar, it's got water tanks, all of those things, you
massively enhancing the value.
Recoup that investment.
Correct.
At home, I've got to put a cover on the pool because I'm realizing the evaporative loss in that pool, and having to then top up from municipal mains in this environment. And doing the show, I've just realized it's just completely irresponsible. So there's always something that we can do. Just as a last message, Craig, the future of water is for you, for Africa Tanks, and someone who's really at the front lines of this unfolding crisis. What is the future of water for you?
May sound a bit cliche, but I guess it's our safeguarding our future generations, our kids and our kids' kids, and thinking about, we often talk about our planet, the environment. Water is life.
Yeah.
There's no truer saying than that. So without it, you just can't, it doesn't matter how clever these AI, models are and AGI and everything else. Fundamentally, we need water to live. And so it really goes to the heart, I think, of humanity and our country. And, we've got to think carefully of how we manage our water resources and protect them and change probably our behaviors, as you say. There's numerous things we can do. So, when I read that statement, the future of water is, it's life and it's fundamental. That's what it is.
Yeah, and it's inalienable. It is fundamental to human life, as you say, and it's the most existential challenge that I think we face as a country. Without any sense of hyperbole, you can survive without power for a couple of days. Try surviving without water, and I worry as well about the rippling social effects in terms of unrest if we don't get that right. So I think we all have a part to play. And what do they say? Every river starts with a single drop. So it starts with us individually. Craig Forbes, thank you very much, Director of Africa Tanks. Great having your insights here on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
Well, it's clear from our conversation that water resilience is built in layers: reliable sources, safe treatment, and storage that bridges interruptions. As discussed today, durable tanks, whether paired with municipal feed, boreholes, or harvested rain, can convert variability into continuity when supported by sound design, water quality assurance, and disciplined maintenance. Impact grows where finance, standards, and local capability meet. A procurement that values life cycle costs, partnership that extend infrastructure into schools and clinics, and practical innovations from smarter controls to improved filtration that all raise reliability without raising risk. With thanks to Craig Forbes for a grounded view of what safeguards quality and what unlocks progress. This has been the Safripol Water Security Engagement Forum with me, Michael Avery.